be clear. Canada does not dump lumber into the United States.
Provide a little bit more lumber within their supply, but there's no way that they can replace the imports coming from Canada.
Well over 35%. I think Americans are going to be finding out very shortly the impact.
What happens when the backbone of America's housing market gets yanked out overnight? Imagine a neighbor who always supplied you with sugar enough to bake every cake in town. Now imagine that neighbor slamming the door and saying, "Make your own." That's exactly what Ontario just did to the United States, and the ripple effects are shaking the entire economy. For decades, America relied on Canada, especially Ontario, to keep its housing industry afloat. From the beams in skyscrapers to the 2x4s in suburban homes, Canadian lumber was the silent partner in the American dream. But after Washington decided to hammer Canada with punishing tariffs, Ontario responded in the boldest way possible, by shutting down the flow of lumber to the U.S. The result? Prices are soaring, builders are panicking, and everyday families are discovering that their shot at owning a home is slipping even further away. But here's the twist. This isn't just a trade fight. Ontario has turned lumber into a geopolitical weapon, reshaping the future of North America's economy. And if America thought it held all the cards, this move proves otherwise. Every trade war has a spark, and this one started with a decision in Washington that looked tough on paper but turned disastrous in practice. The United States decided to crank up tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber, a product it has fought Canada over for decades. Back in August 2024, duties sat at around 14.5%. By early 2025, they climbed to 20.56%, and then came the sledgehammer. Washington pushed the rate to an eye-watering 35%, one of the steepest in history. The justification? U.S. officials accused Canada of dumping cheap lumber into the American market, undermining domestic producers. But the truth is, America has never been self-sufficient in wood. Even when U.S. sawmills are running flat out, they can only cover about 70% of the country's demand. The missing 30%? That's Canada. For decades, Canadian lumber has been the invisible scaffolding of American growth, quietly filling in the gap every time U.S. supply fell short. Ontario, which accounts for a massive chunk of that flow, saw the new tariffs as an insult and an attack. Instead of bowing to the pressure, the province struck back with its own nuclear option, cutting supply. Overnight, Ontario slashed shipments that once totaled 28 million cubic meters of lumber each year. To put that in perspective, that's enough wood to frame 16 Empire State Buildings every single month. It wasn't just about economics, it was about sending a message. Ontario's leaders framed the move as a direct response to American bullying. If you want to charge us more, fine, the logic went, but don't expect us to keep carrying your housing market. It was a bold declaration, a line in the sand, and in that moment, a quiet trade dispute exploded into a continental crisis, one that would leave American builders, homeowners, and politicians scrambling for answers. When Ontario pulled the plug on its lumber exports, the shockwaves rippled instantly through the American housing market. Builders who had already been squeezed by inflation and labor shortages suddenly found their most critical material vanishing, and the costs of what remained skyrocketing. Industry analysts didn't mince words. They warned that the lumber squeeze could add an extra $1,000 to $14,000 to the cost of building an average single-family home by 2027. For families already fighting to buy into the market, this wasn't just bad news, it was devastating. Mortgage rates were already punishingly high, and now the raw cost of materials was threatening to push the American dream completely out of reach. The futures market told the same grim story. Lumber prices, which had once stabilized around $500 per thousand board feet, spiked to $650 almost overnight. Experts sounded the alarm that prices could surge to $765 if Ontario kept the squeeze in place. For builders, that meant budgets collapsing, projects stalling, and profits disappearing. For buyers, it meant one thing. Homes that were once barely affordable were now entirely out of reach. The pain wasn't spread evenly either. In California, where housing affordability was already a crisis, Every extra dollar meant fewer families could hope to own a home. In Texas, where new housing developments were powering rapid growth, the lumber shock was like slamming the brakes on an entire economy. States that thrived on construction were suddenly staring at a bleak future of higher costs and slower growth. And this was just the beginning. Because while the housing market was the most visible casualty, the ripple effects of Ontario's move were about to hit far deeper into the U.S. economy. And the one question on everyone's mind was, how much worse could it get? When Ontario slammed the brakes on lumber shipments, some in Washington brushed it off, insisting America could simply make up the difference. But that idea fell apart the moment experts crunched the numbers. The reality is simple. The U.S. can't replace Ontario. Not quickly, not cheaply, and maybe not at all. Even at maximum output, American sawmills can only cover about 70% of domestic demand. The rest has always been filled by Canada. Scaling up production sounds good in theory, but in practice it's a nightmare. Environmental regulations mean new permits drag on for years. Forest losses from wildfires have already reduced available timberland. Add to that a chronic shortage of skilled mill workers, and the dream of suddenly expanding production turns into a bureaucratic and logistical dead end. What about finding new suppliers abroad? That's no better. Europe can only offer scraps compared to Ontario's output. Germany manages around 2 million cubic meters a year, Sweden barely 1 million, and Chile adds a few more. Put them all together, and you still don't reach 15% of what Canada normally provides. Worse, transporting lumber across the Atlantic or from South America adds months of delay and piles of shipping costs. So here's the uncomfortable truth. America's housing market is structurally dependent on Canadian lumber, and Ontario controls one of the largest slices of that supply. Without it, builders aren't just inconvenienced, they're trapped. And Ontario knows this. By pulling back supply, they've highlighted just how fragile America's position really is. Washington can raise tariffs all at once, but unless it finds a way to conjure millions of cubic meters of lumber out of thin air, Ontario's leverage isn't going anywhere. And just when the U.S. thought it had backed Canada into a corner, Ontario flipped the script with a bold, global pivot. Ontario's decision to slash lumber exports wasn't just about punishing Washington, it was about proving a point and reshaping the game. While American builders scrambled, Ontario quietly revealed its real strategy: diversification. Instead of depending on a single market that constantly slapped them with duties, Ontario began turning outward, building new relationships with countries that welcomed Canadian wood with open arms. Through the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, Ontario unlocked tariff-free access to massive markets like Japan, Australia, and Singapore. These aren't minor buyers, they're booming economies hungry for construction materials, and they value reliable partners. Unlike Washington, they weren't calling Canadian lumber unfair competition. They were eager to sign contracts. And then came Europe. Thanks to the Canada-EU Trade Agreement, CETA, Ontario's high-quality wood products, everything from raw timber to refined engineered pieces, can enter the European Union without a single tariff. That means Ontario wood could soon be supporting luxury Paris apartments, Berlin office towers, or London infrastructure projects, all while American developers pay inflated prices just to frame a suburban home. This pivot wasn't improvisation, it was strategy. Ontario's leaders knew that relying too heavily on the U.S. made them vulnerable. By broadening their horizons, they've transformed a crisis into an opportunity. Suddenly, the same supply that Washington was trying to punish became a highly sought-after commodity elsewhere. The message couldn't be clearer: we don't need you anymore. For decades, the U.S. assumed Canada had no choice but to keep selling south. Now Ontario is proving that the world is big, and their options are plenty. But what really makes this pivot powerful is that Ontario isn't just finding new buyers, it's reinventing the very products it sells. And that's where the story takes an even sharper turn. Ontario didn't just pivot to new markets, it reinvented its playbook. Instead of focusing solely on raw lumber, which the U.S. could easily target with tariffs, the province doubled down on something smarter: value-added products. Think of it this way. Shipping stacks of raw timber across the border makes it easy for Washington to slap on penalties. but ship a prefabricated wall section, engineered wood beam, or a set of finished cabinets, and suddenly the rules change. These aren't classified as lumber in the same way. They often fall into entirely different trade categories, ones that dodge the US tariff net. And here's the kicker. These products sell for far more than raw wood. A 2x4 is cheap. A ready-to-install kitchen or modular housing unit is not. Ontario's mills realized they could earn more profit per shipment while reducing their exposure to hostile trade measures. It was a classic case of turning defense into offense. This isn't just theory, it's already happening. Back in 2020, while raw lumber exports to the US fell, Ontario's processed wood exports actually rose by 12%. That trend has only accelerated as billions in Canadian government support pour into the industry. The new focus is clear. Move up the value chain, insulate against tariffs, and create products that the world can't resist. It's also a domestic win. Ontario's own construction industry is shifting toward green and modular building programs that rely heavily on engineered wood. By supplying both local projects and global buyers, the province ensures its mills stay busy, profitable, and secure. In short, Ontario has flipped the script. Tariffs that were meant to punish Canada have instead pushed it to evolve faster, smarter, and stronger. And while Ontario forges ahead, America is left drowning in rising costs. But lumber and construction aren't the only victims. This trade war is rippling far deeper into U.S. life than most people realize. When Ontario shut the door on lumber, it didn't just rattle construction sites, it set off shockwaves across the entire American economy. Suddenly, the crisis wasn't about just one material, it was about everything connected to it. Building a house or a skyscraper takes more than wood. You need steel beams, aluminum frames, copper wiring, and nails by the ton. The problem? Washington had already piled tariffs onto those imports too. A 35% tariff on Canadian goods and an even harsher 50% tariff on metals meant that every part of the construction process was now bleeding money. The frame, the wiring, the plumbing, even the trucks hauling materials to sites, all of it cost more. The result? Projects stalled, budgets collapsed, and developers braced for losses they couldn't offset. But the ripple effect went beyond construction. Across border towns, a quiet economic lifeline was cut. For decades, Canadians poured across to shop in American outlet malls, fuel their cars, and dine in local restaurants. Now, with tariffs and tensions running high, those trips are vanishing. Traffic at the Rainbow Bridge dropped 33%. The Peace Bridge saw a 12% decline. Erie County, New York lost $4.9 million in tax revenue in a single month. That's not just a dent in the budget. That's teachers unfunded, potholes left unfilled, and small businesses forced to close. And here's the irony. While Washington claimed these tariffs were about protecting American jobs, the reality is the opposite. Construction workers, retail staff, and manufacturers across the U.S. are the ones paying the price. Families can't afford homes, local economies are shrinking, and industries built on cross-border cooperation are crumbling. Yet Ontario isn't slowing down, it's doubling down. By weaponizing lumber, it's showing how a single resource can shake an empire. For decades, lumber was treated as just another commodity, something you cut, ship, and sell. But Ontario's bold move has rewritten that story. In today's trade war, lumber isn't just wood anymore, it's a weapon. By cutting off supply, Ontario turned a basic resource into a bargaining chip powerful enough to shake the foundations of the U.S. economy. And it's not just about blocking exports. With Ottawa's backing, Ontario is now armed with over $1 billion in federal support to strengthen its softwood industry. That funding ensures mills can keep running, workers can stay employed, and the province can pivot aggressively toward new markets. In other words, Ontario isn't playing defense, it's building a stronger offense. The message to Washington couldn't be clearer. We'd love to keep trading, but we don't actually need you. That single sentence flips decades of assumptions on their head. For years, the U.S. acted as though Canada had no choice but to sell south. Ontario just proved the opposite. By opening doors in Asia and Europe, investing in value-added products, and securing domestic demand, The province has shown it can thrive without depending on America at all. And that's where the geopolitical power lies. Whoever controls supply controls the conversation. Washington may still be the bigger economy, but Ontario now holds something even more valuable: leverage. They've demonstrated that one province, by recognizing its strategic position, can force the world's largest economy to the negotiating table. This is more than lumber. It's a preview of the future. If Ontario can use wood to rattle the United States, what happens when Canada applies the same strategy to energy, critical minerals, or food exports? Suddenly, the balance of power on the continent looks very different. And that leaves America facing a brutal choice: adapt or be left behind. What started as a dispute over lumber has grown into something far larger, a turning point in North America's economic balance of power. Ontario has proven that even a single province, when it recognizes its leverage, can force the United States to bend. This wasn't just about cutting supply. It was about demonstrating that resources can be as powerful as armies and as disruptive as sanctions. For decades, Washington assumed it held all the cards. America was the giant, Canada the junior partner. Lumber was supposed to be a one-way street, Canada supplying, America dictating. But now the roles are reversed. By shutting off the flow, Ontario showed that the U.S. is far more dependent on Canadian resources than it ever wanted to admit. The consequences are already visible. Housing costs spiraling out of reach, construction projects stalled, border towns losing millions, and an economy groaning under the weight of tariffs that were supposed to protect it. Meanwhile, Ontario has opened new doors across Asia and Europe, turned raw wood into high-value exports, and secured billions in federal investment. In short, they've insulated themselves from America while America is left scrambling. And here's the real lesson. If Ontario can do this with lumber, what's stopping Canada from using the same playbook with energy, critical minerals, or agriculture? Imagine if the oil, copper, or even food that America takes for granted suddenly became bargaining chips too. The message is clear. The era of U.S. dominance by default is over. So now, Washington faces a choice. It can adapt, recognizing Canada as an equal partner and rebuilding trust. Or it can continue down the path of confrontation and risk losing even more ground. Because once you've proven you can win a trade war with wood, you've proven you can change the rules with anything. And Ontario just showed the world how it's done.